You'll see in our pre-budget submission, our overseas aid programme is not keeping pace with the need or indeed the targets that Ireland has committed to. Ireland's leadership at an international level should ensure the immediate and radical mobilisation of aid into the Horn of Africa region in particular. In that regard, we're here collectively to ask for the following. Rich nations, including Ireland, must immediately scale up and release flexible multi-year funding to meet the UN appeal for Ethiopia, Kenya and Somalia. Ireland should continue to advocate at the UN Security Council for accountability for those who seek to use starvation as a weapon of war. Ireland should support the scale-up of investment in social protection programmes and sustainable livelihoods to protect and to continue and strengthen hard-won development gains. Major grain exporting countries must refrain from food export restrictions and protect WFP supply chains. And rich polluting nations, including Ireland, must do more to lower CO2 emissions and provide increased finance to support adaptation measures. We need political action and leadership to prevent a catastrophic humanitarian disaster. Each day of delay exacerbates human suffering, increases the scale of the crisis, and raises the cost of response. Before I pass over to Sean, our chair, I would like to show a short video that illustrates the stark reality for those worst affected living in Ethiopia, Kenya and Somalia today.
The pictures tell it all. Thank you indeed, Jane Ann, for that introduction. And interestingly, you saw that clip of the former President, Mary Robinson, from the last occasion when these four major development and aid organisations came together. That was a trip that was organised for media to Somalia, and you may recall the reports that were regularly run on RT television and radio by my late and much lamented colleague Jim Fahey. There were other reports done by Charlie Bird. You would have seen bits of them last night on the that marvellous documentary that was broadcast by John Kelleher, made by John Kelleher. As I say, Goal, Concern, Trócaire and Oxfam coming together, and they're going to give us some short presentations now. The first speaker we were going to hear from is Mary Van Lieshout, Deputy CEO and Director of External Affairs with Goal. Mary has over 20 years experience in the humanitarian sector, working in the fields of humanitarian public health research and advocacy.
In times of food shortages, mothers and girls reduce personal food consumption to provide for others. They carry additional responsibility for sick family members and undertake arduous journeys of personal risk to find water. In many cases, women and girls are subjected to sexual and gender-based violence or exploitation. Desperate families that have exhausted their reserves are forced to resort to negative coping strategies, mechanisms to survive, including dropping out of school early, particularly for girls, and early and child marriage with all of the attendant risks. We're here today because we have to sound the alarm on the scale of this humanitarian crisis, which is being compounded by conflict, climate change, and the crisis on our doorstep in Ukraine. Mary Robinson has said it on countless occasions. We must refuse to be bystanders. As a nation, we always stand tall and respond to the suffering of others in times of crisis, and we simply need to act. Thank you very much.
We're going to hear now from somebody who is a regular visitor to the Horn of Africa. Amina Ibrahim Abdullah is Concern's Regional Director for the Horn of Africa. She's been with Concern now for some time. Amina, over to you.
The story of Antutu Sharamo and Diara Ibrahim that we saw on the video is similar to that of millions of mothers across the Horn of Africa. What we are seeing is an unprecedented level of need resulting from 4 consecutive failed rainy seasons, coming at the back of a number of other crises. It's a region that faced a locust infestation in 2019-2020, a region that had to do with the global COVID-19 pandemic, just like any other country across the world. We are looking at up to 5.7 million children that are currently requiring treatment for acute malnutrition. Of those, 1.7 million are facing severe acute malnutrition. Diseases such as cholera and measles are on the rise in many of the regions in Horn of Africa. This is purely resulting from the levels of displacement and the lack of water, amongst other needs that have come as a result of the drought. In Somalia, Concern supports mothers and grandmothers who've walked for days with frail children in search of food and healthcare. In IDP camps across Somalia in Baidoa, Bardere, and Mogadishu, pregnant mothers are choosing to take this dangerous trek to give their unborn child a chance of survival. This is what we're facing in the region as a result of the drought. The Benadir Mother and Child Hospital that Concern supports in Mogadishu is currently overwhelmed, receiving on average 15 cases of severe acute malnutrition daily. I know for many of us, the scale is difficult to comprehend, especially when you consider that health services in parts of this region were already struggling to provide the basic. One may ask, how did we get here when in 2011 we said never again? But I'd like to say that as aid agencies, we have raised the alarm over the last 12 months from the time when the May 2021 rainy season was declared a failed season. We have watched over the last 12 years, collectively as international community, as numbers of people affected by the drought soared, thousands of people displaced from their homes and lands, to a point where currently the needs have outstripped the resources that are available. Advocacy efforts with donors and international partners at country level have been overshadowed by global political agendas that have prioritized certain crises. But for many of us, it is not a case of either or, but rather a case of widening the scope to address other crises. What is happening in Ukraine is indeed heartbreaking, and a political solution is required to end the conflict. Yes, the world does need to focus on what is happening in Ukraine, but it shouldn't be, as I said, about one crisis or the other, because the conflict in Ukraine is having a devastating impact on drought-affected communities in the Horn of Africa, with prices rocketing, exacerbating an already dire hunger situation in the region. There are questions of what are the governments in these respective countries doing, and it has been frustrating for us as aid agencies because political leadership on the issue has been lacking due to either leadership wrangles, focus on local elections, or conflict in parts of the country. All these political sideshows are taking attention away from a catastrophic situation that is currently unfolding in these countries. It is also important to state that impediments to humanitarian access leave many people without assistance and increases the levels of displacement to get to centers where humanitarian assistance is available. For communities whose capacities to cope have been exhausted, scaling up our collective action at the moment is their only hope. Doing otherwise means imminent starvation and death for hundreds of thousands of children. To scale up, we need resources, as my colleague has just talked about. As we respond to the crisis, we must also look into long-term solutions. It's the sustained investments in government-made social protection programs as well as NGO safety nets that have been effective in supporting resilience and staving off the crisis up to this point. The crisis is shaping up to be worse than what we experienced in 2011. If 2011 we were talking about 13 million people in need of assistance or affected, we are now looking at 23 million across the region. That's double the numbers we dealt with in 2011. With a potential fifth rainy season looming, I can't underscore the need to act now enough. So we must act now. Thank you very much.
Amina, thank you so much. We're going to hear now from the Chief Executive Officer of Trócaire, Caoimhe de Barra. Prior to taking on the role of CEO just 4 years ago, Caoimhe worked as Country Director for Concern Worldwide in Malawi for 3 years. Before that, she'd spent 18 years in Trócaire, progressing through a range of roles from Campaigns Officer to Director of the International Division by 2018. So we're going to hear now from somebody with vast experience of working on the issues affecting the poorest and the most marginalised people. Caoimhe de Barra.
It's hard to believe we're back here again. It is, of course, due to a complex and compounding set of factors: conflict, COVID, climate change, political factors and governance factors. But the reality is that there is one element of all of this that is entirely predictable and that makes this crisis, or at least a large part of it, avoidable. It's something we need to respond to both in the short and the longer term, and it's climate change. So my colleagues have given a broad spectrum view of the entire situation. I'll focus on this one issue and its impact and what we need to do about it. Many people in this room are highly expert on climate change, far more so than I, but bear with me. The Global South is bearing the brunt of climate injustice and climate change. More than 90% of the costs of climate breakdown are felt in the Global South, and 98% of the deaths as a result of climate breakdown happen in the Global South. The people most affected amongst those harmed are women and children. In fact, women and children are 14 times more likely to die as a result of a disaster than men are. And 80% of the people who are displaced by climate breakdown are women as well. So this whole complex interrelated factors doesn't only have a bearing on people who are living in poverty or living on the margins, but within that it also has a bearing on women and girls and on an intergenerational cycle of poverty. The most vulnerable communities, it is apparent to us all, are worst hit by climate change. What's our responsibility? I'm going to focus on one country, Somalia. Amina's already mentioned Somalia, so I'll just add to that. So Somalia has a population of about 3 times the size of Ireland. Ireland emits 54 times more carbon than the entire country of Somalia. That just seems to me like a gross injustice. That's something that we need to take responsibility for. So one thing that is part of our recommendations is that as a country, we take our global carbon emissions reductions very seriously and we drive as hard as we can to reduce those because of the broad impact that that has on situations such as that in front of us right now. But those impacts are long-lasting and they are very wide in scope. Now, in Somalia, as in the other countries that we're focusing mostly on today, though there are many others affected, Kenya and Ethiopia, we've witnessed 4 successive rainy seasons failing. And the projections for Somalia for the next 6 months are that the rainfall is going to be below average. Now, those words, to those of us who are working in the humanitarian sphere, are the words you do not want to hear. Neither do you want to necessarily hear above average, because what is happening in terms of patterns provoked by climate change is that you never get the sort of rainfall that would help in terms of productive agricultural capacity. Above average rainfall can result in catastrophic droughts. Below average rainfall, catastrophic flooding. Below average, catastrophic droughts. So we need to look at how we are working in this new environment in an entirely different way. The reality is that when we're faced with an extreme crisis such as the humanitarian crisis unfolding right in front of us right now, 181 million people affected in 41 countries, as Mary said, that is astounding. However, what we need to do is to acknowledge that the humanitarian system that we have built and that we're relying on to address these humanitarian crises is not going to solve the problem in the longer term. We need to have financing which of course addresses the immediate needs of people affected by acute malnutrition, acute lack of food, acute need for sanitation, shelter and other supports. But we also need to have climate finance which addresses the long-term impacts. Countries that are most affected by climate change need funding for adaptation. They need funding for loss and damage. We need to take a much stronger policy stance here from the island of Ireland, and never to underestimate the kind of influence that Ireland has and can bring to bear through our voice at the UN, at the European Union and in many other fora, but really pushing on those long-term financing facilities so that we can ultimately move away from a situation where the humanitarian community is struggling, and it is difficult, and we do hope to make the biggest difference that we can, but struggling to address a long-term problem where the financing structures are very ill-suited and ill-equipped to address it. So my parting words then are that in terms of a recommendation to those of you here in this audience who are involved in policy making and policy influencing, and I'm very glad to see so many of you here, thank you for coming, is that we need to make sure that richer countries, including Ireland, that emit most carbon emissions, must do more and do better to lower our own global CO2 emissions. We need to compensate countries such as those in East Africa that Amina has spoken so eloquently about for their climate losses and damages, for the loss and damage that they will never be able to repair themselves. And we need to provide increased finance for our climate adaptation measures. I strongly believe that in this country we have the understanding and the will to take action. And I think that now with this climate crisis, this crisis which is underpinned by a range of factors so starkly set out in front of us, this is the moment to adopt a policy response which puts climate at the heart of it, while also addressing the immediate needs of those 181 million people, many of whom come to our doors. And just to reinforce what Amina said, Trócaire works in the Ghetto region in south-central Somalia. It's a region the size of the island of Ireland. Trócaire supports local community structures to run health clinics and hospitals. Almost every day, people come to our outreach centres in informal displaced camps. They have taken that journey, walked with their family members for 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, and many of them, when they arrive, talk about the family members they've lost on the way. To come back to Mary Robinson's statement, there's no dignity in watching your child die. Mothers in Somalia love their children no less than mothers here in Ireland. So I think we all have a moral responsibility, as well as a policy responsibility and a policy capability to respond in a broad-based way to this crisis. Thank you.
Our last speaker from the aid agencies is somebody who was there in 2011 for that joint initiative in Somalia with Mary Robinson. Would you welcome, please, from UNICEF, Jim Clark, their Chief Executive.
Actually from Oxfam, sure.
I beg your pardon. I should have got a Specsavers.
You've heard from my colleagues about the extent of the crisis that we're facing. Unprecedented in recent times. 23 million people at the brink of starvation. And you know, Sean mentioned that I had been on that original visit that was carried out in 2011 along with Mary Robinson and others, and Jim Fahey, and we had international media. And we were able to, well, it was too late. It was too late by the time we got there. It was too late for the international community to respond. And 250,000 people died. I mean, the numbers are staggering, right? And, you know, it's so, you know, as a result of that, we produced what was called the Dangerous Delay. It was a seminal piece of work to just identify the kind of failings that the international community had at that time. And I'm very sad to say that we have now had to produce the Dangerous Delay 2, a follow-up to this that nobody wanted to happen. Nobody wanted to see, because all of the warnings and all of the indicators of how we can respond better to the kind of crisis that we face then are there and worse than before. And we, as Frida said, in the sector, honestly believed that we were looking beyond this. We were looking beyond extreme food crises across the world. We were looking to the development stage where communities and countries were moving beyond that, and that the word famine rightly was consigned to the history books. The famine in 2011 was the first of the 21st century, and it should have been the last. But here we are, you know, looking at this, and I think it's important to state that famine is an abomination. It's a failure of humanity. It's a failure of politics, global politics. It should never happen. There's more than enough money and more than enough food in the world to feed everybody. And there's more than enough political will when necessary to make big changes happen, such as what has been spoken about in terms of climate. We cannot say that there have been no early warnings. Never before have we had the benefit of meteorological expertise, of forecasting, of satellite imagery, of data analysis, distribution networks, and even local disaster management. And that's a big move of our sector in recent years, is to ensure that disaster management is run by local people for themselves, who are best positioned, who know more than any of us do. And that has been working. But it's not enough, because we're not addressing the root causes and the symptoms of food crisis. And it's been a downward spiral, crisis upon crisis, climate, COVID and conflict, all coming together along with what has happened in Ukraine. And it's slowly overwhelming communities and families' ability to cope. And as Amina rightly said, we have seen this coming now for over 2 years. We've been trying to raise the flag about this for over 2 years. And the deafening noise of everything else has been pushing this off the headlines. And as Cuiva said, the humanitarian system that we work in is just not designed to respond to the crises at the scale and frequency that we're experiencing. Yes, we have been there to be able to respond to crises as they come up over the last 20, 30, 40 years. But there's nothing compared to what's happening now and what is going to continue to happen over and over again, unless we really transform the way that we not just respond, that we prepare for emergencies. Even from but even from an economic perspective, for every €1 or dollar you spend in prevention, you save $3 or euros in having to intervene later on. It makes, not that should be the driver. The human suffering, avoiding human suffering should be the key driver. But even from an economic perspective, it makes no sense to perform and behave in the way that we do. Only 20% of the world's global humanitarian responses for this year are funded. In this specific crisis, we're talking about $4.4 billion required. When you think about the trillions of dollars we were able to mobilize when it came to the pandemic, when you think about, amazingly, the $13 billion that the world was able to mobilize when it came to Ukraine, the money is there, but the money needs to be mobilized, and it needs to be mobilized quickly. And I think it's just important for us not to feel helpless. When you see the kind of number and the scale and the extraordinary suffering that's happening and happening in so many places, it is tempting to feel helpless and to feel, well, that just happens and there's not much I can do about it. That's not the case. This is not inevitable. We're facing into it, but we can prevent it. And we've done it before. The world came together in 2017 and prevented a massive famine happening in Somalia because it heeded the warnings, because it responded, because it acted. We need to do exactly the same now. We need to do it urgently, and we need to tackle those longer-term issues. So what I would be asking is to repeat some of the pleas that we have in our report, is that Ireland and rich countries must immediately scale up the flexible multi-year funding to help to meet the UN humanitarian needs, particularly in those 3 countries that we're referring to in the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia, Kenya and Somalia, to help save lives now. Ireland must continue to use its voice, and it has done quite effectively at the UN Security Council, to make the linkages between COVID, between conflict, between hunger and the crisis that we're facing, and hold those who are exacerbating this situation to account. Call them out, be courageous, identify countries that are intentionally putting blockages in place, creating situations that have made this crisis worse than it was before. It was already mentioned, but the investment in social protection programs, which is that floor that we are lucky to have in this part of the world, that every country needs to make sure nobody falls below a certain level. Investment in that in recent years has made a tremendous difference in the places that has been affected. Many countries are hamstrung because of the extraordinary levels of international debt they need to repay. We need to look at debt forgiveness. We need to look at aid programs that specifically focus on the investment in social protection. We need to make sure that major grain exporting countries immediately refrain from imposing food export restrictions. That is unacceptable in this situation. There is still more than enough food in the world to feed everybody. We can't allow countries to hoard it. And then, as Caoimhe has mentioned so eloquently in relation to polluting nations, Ireland has to do more. We have to move faster to lower our CO2 emissions. We need to compensate East African countries for the climate loss and damage and provide the increased finance to support adaptation measures. Those three countries create 0.1% of of CO2 emissions for the entire world. 0.1%. And they're suffering at the harsh end of climate impact. That's unacceptable, and it's wrong, morally wrong, and it's wrong at so many levels, and we all know it. And we have to turn that ship around. And then finally, parliamentarians here, I just plead with you to champion the cause of the world's poorest and amplify their voices in your spaces, in your parties, in the places that you go, that you're in, to ensure that we protect the lives, security, human rights, and well-being of those that are furthest behind. We can't allow this to descend into a space where we're looking at the kind of images that we looked at 11 years ago, that we looked at in the 80s. This is the 21st century. So many things are possible with sufficient goodwill. The technology is there, and we need to see the energy there too. This is the biggest crisis facing the world today, without a shadow of a doubt. It needs to be out there. We need to be talking about it. We need to be acting on it, and we need to act now. Thanks very much.
I'd first just like to extend a big thank you to Sean for chairing today, but also to our panel, to Mary, Amina, Caoimhe and Jim. I think it made for a very rich session, and I hope that you found it very informative and come away, although very sobering, I think, particularly the number of facts. There is action that can be taken, and I think this is what we are asking for collectively as a sector. There's action that can be taken in terms of scaling up our funding to meet the UN appeal for Ethiopia, for Somalia, for Kenya. We can advocate more at the UN Security Council level for accountability for those who seek to use starvation as a weapon of war. We can support the scale-up of investment in social protection programmes and in sustainable livelihoods. We can act to try and protect WFP supply chains, and we can do more to lower CO2 emissions. These are actions that we can take collectively as Ireland, and this is our plea here, standing here on behalf of all of the international development humanitarian organisations that are here today. And I'd really like to thank you all for your participation and for your engagement here. I know we have more of our members with us here in the group as well, and I'm sure that the panel and our members will be happy to chat to any of you if you have any questions or comments. And indeed, Dóchas, we are here and we are available to speak on any of these issues and to link you with any of our members, particularly on any of the issues that you heard today. So thanks very much.